So I'm Alan Macy, and I live in Santa Barbara, and I work at a biomedical engineering company as a designer, and I'm also an artist.
Very good. We find ourselves in Shanghai this lovely day, despite the fact that we both live in the same state in the United States. What brings you to Shanghai?
Well, several years ago, I was at a transformational festival in Santa Barbara called Lucidity, and I met Gino Yu there, and so we developed a connection as a consequence of that, and so I've been invited to different kinds of things. I would suspect mostly because of that relationship.
Yes, very good. I think Gino is sort of the hub of a lot of us. Certainly, that's the reason I'm here as well. What drew you to this field?
The field of the kind of context of the conference here?
Yeah.
The sort of Buddhism and science and technology?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not a Buddhist, and although I read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, like many of us did, and so it had an influence on me, and so I've certainly become aware of its impact and Buddhism's impact in contemporary culture, and I've come to think of it, I guess, historically as like I know it's a religion, but it has aspects of it which tend to kind of put it in a little bit of a different spot in my own mind.
Yeah. And the reason that I specifically wanted to talk to you, I just heard your wonderful talk on stage. Hopefully they will publicize that, and I'll get to put a link to that in the show notes for anybody that's watching this after. But it was going over different sensors, and I'm very passionate about this idea that we put down the keyboard, we put down the mouse, we're not swiping anymore. And we have all these other possibilities of using the entire body, not only the motions and the pose and the gestures of the body, but also different sensors. So can you give us a rundown of all that great stuff you just talked about?
Yeah, well, in the talk I was focusing on a pretty specific sensor set, and these have to do with the sensing of the circumplex model of affect and motivational state measurements. And so the circumplex model of affect, we're looking at this phenomena called valence, which ranges from pleasure to displeasure, and then looking also at this axis called arousal, which goes from boredom to aroused. And then you can sort of think of this as a two-dimensional space, with this as the horizontal axis and that the vertical axis. And depending on how one navigates through your life, you're kind of this dot that moves through this space. And sometimes you're more displeased, and sometimes you're more pleased, and sometimes you're bored, and sometimes you're aroused, and all these things in between. And so that was sort of one kind of category of measurements that are related to this thing called affect, which is the physiological representation or the physiological manifestation of emotion. And because emotion's not actually directly measurable, and
thus it's not been studied until very recently.
Yeah, and it's quite confusing. Like there are many theories actually about what an emotion is, and no one really knows quite what it is. And then this other phenomena, and I think one of the things is that we work with psychophysiologists. These are people who study mind-body interactions at the academic level, and so they're very concerned.
I'd be best friends with all of them. I just want to come
they're an interesting group.
Sit on their shoulder and listen to their conversations.
Every major psychology department at a university will have a psychophysiological component, and there's a kind of movement afoot to consider, that part of psychology. I think you would normally get like a BA, but I think now certain programs are even offering a BS in psychology because of this evolution of these kind of more objective measures.
Right, because mind and body have been, or rather brain and body, I think mind is debate. Let's not get into the word game of what a mind is, but brain and body have been so completely in different departments, like literally in different buildings. And then psychology, there's like the neuroscience aspect of brain, and then there's psychology. They're literally in different buildings, and there's not much cross-pollination until it seems like it's getting better of late. Is that?
Yeah, historically I think it's been very much like that. Like the brain's sort of like in this sort of special hierarchical category, and maybe it needs to be, I don't know, but if you look at the physiology, underlying physiology, there's no real clear point actually where the brain stops. It's, it just kind of extends into the nervous system, and it's the same neuronal kind of communication mechanisms that just extend through the whole body. So
there's 40,000 neurons in the heart, am I right?
Yeah, I don't know the exact number, but there's a huge
not a small number.
It's not a small number, and there's a huge neuronal mass right next to the stomach that is
that's where you're
sizable.
A gut feeling.
Exactly.
Like
I probably
need a gut to have a gut feeling. You need a stomach to have butterflies in your stomach.
It's a good sized little brain down there.
That's so fascinating.
And this other thing was motivational state, which is not really an emotion, or it's recently psychophysiologists started studying this in the like year 2000 or maybe a little before, and this idea of what's called a core relational theme, and some of the key work was done by Jim Blaskovich out of UCSB, and a core relational theme has to do with this kind of just two things really that they're looking at is challenge and threat. So are we challenged by certain kinds of activities that we're faced with, or are we threatened by them? And a challenge response is like an aerobic response, and a threat response is sort of like a retraction. And so these things can be indexed by looking at just a few variables off the human body, non-invasive variables like blood pressure and stroke volume and vascular resistance. And you can characterize these things really well, like separate, is it a challenge, is it a threat?
So you can tell me if I got this right. There is an increase in blood pressure in one and not an increase in pressure in challenge. So there's an increase in blood pressure in threat, but not in challenge.
That's right,
and then there is an increase in heart rate.
In stroke volume.
Stroke volume.
Which is the amount of blood that your heart pumps each time it beats. So there's an increase in blood when you're in a challenge state, blood flow or the amount of blood that your heart beats with each beat, that amount increases with challenge, and then there's little to no change in threat condition. And then vascular resistance reduces in the case of challenge, and in the case of threat, it increases.
Fascinating. So I understand that the neural pathways for thrill and excitement are the same. So I'm wondering if there are ways to sort of flip the coin, and if somebody's in threat mode, can you ask them to do things that will push them into challenge mode?
No question. It's pretty clear that that things that were a threat response to somebody can easily be made into a challenge response. A classic example is public speaking.
I was just about to say, I just did this.
And so it's not an entirely natural thing for many people, and so there often people experience that as a kind of, they have a threat response to it, but really with like enough practice of public speaking and the proper training, it can rather rapidly turn into a challenge response. And I guess this is why so many people are interested in that those particular aspects of behavior, is that they're directly addressable by training.
Well, what I did, I just spoke at a conference in March, and it was the first time I was doing this talk, and I was just really wigged out. I usually don't get super wigged out. In this talk, I was backstage, and I was dancing to get myself to switch from threat to challenge, in the hope that you can't be both at the same time.
Oh yeah, that's probably a good strategy.
And it was pretty effective. It's definitely the most effective thing that I have found. It's far more effective than imagining the audience in their underwear. That just doesn't work for me at all.
Yeah, wow, okay. That's great. Well, that's a good one to keep in your back pocket.
And I'm interested in how VR and AR can get people more into their bodies, and as a way to change their brain state. And building things like dance games where you're incentivized to be very active as a way to, if you came home from a really bad day at the office and you're in threat mode and you want to transition into a challenge mode, then you could play a dance game and it would get your state sort of back. Because then when you come off of the challenge, you just sort of calm down, versus threat seems like it's more persistent. In thinking about something like a dance game, maybe it's useful to have a sensor on the body to even further incentivize the player when they're doing something that's moving them to a more a productive or a happier state of emotion. What kind of sensors might support that?
So to move someone to kind of happier place.
Yeah, if you were to design an experience and you want to be able to say, this is making people happier, what sort of sensors would you want to have on them, and then what would you be looking for those numbers to indicate?
Yeah, I think probably the sensors that would be most ideal for that probably would be microfacial expression sensors, and so these would be electromyographic sensors that are looking at the electrical activity of certain muscles on the face. And I probably should qualify this too, is that there are parts of the body that are more autonomic, so that we feel like maybe we don't have a lot of control over, like the heartbeat and
your pancreas.
Exactly, right, there you go. Or, but we're like pretty used to like lifting an arm or something, and so that's like a lot of voluntary control. Right. And then some things that are kind of in between, like respiration, and that one, like we think we have kind of some voluntary control, but only to the point that if we stop breathing, we'll pass out, and then we'll start breathing again while we're like unconscious. So, I mean, that's kind of an in-between one, and they're probably all in between on some level, really. Like we may think we have some voluntary control or full control, but we know enough from our electromyographic studies that even when someone's sitting like this and they can think that they're relaxed in their shoulders, there's actually can be fairly activated. And two people can look identical and one can be sort of activated and one can be sort of relaxed. And so maybe the motion, they're not moving, but they're still like a kind of like pre-motion, like a proto-motion.
The tension that's held in your shoulders.
Exactly. And so this all reflects to what's all called all kinds of striated muscle through the body. And so it especially is evident in the muscles in the face. And so you can even see kind of contractions of facial muscles even before that they're visible. And so however, all this stuff can be gamed to a degree. Like if someone knew precisely how this worked, they could maybe fool the interface or something. But if they're embodied, having an embodied experience, then maybe they'll just sort of forget about it, and then you could do some sort of tracking.
It would no longer be a fun thing to do. So sure, somebody could do that, but it doesn't matter.
Now, but there's also this kind of other, like that would be kind of very direct measure, those kind of like microfacial expressions, but we talked about Mikey Siegel before, and he's a brilliant friend of mine that lives in San Carlos now, and he's a kind of local focal point of this community in a worldwide community called consciousness hacking. And so he said something to me once about like his perception about human physiology, which always stuck with me, which is this idea that you can look at any kind of physiologic variable, and a very good one is the heart, and it's like the heart rate and aspects of that electrical signal, they're very holistic because the body is this, it seeks homeostasis, and so there's all this sort of like everything's linked. And so if you look at probably any single physiological variable, and maybe some are better than others in terms of being maybe more holistic, but they if you look at them with enough detail and throw enough math at it and extract the actionable vectors, you can kind of learn a huge amount just by looking at one thing that may feel like it's quite indirect, actually. And so there's a lot of work in the subject of heart rate variability as related to like emotional state.
As I understand it, heart rate variability is pretty easy to measure. So things like, presumably, the Apple Watch could be measuring that. I know it's measuring heart rate already. I've seen things that use the phone, your camera phoned, but I mean, it's very easy and accessible. So it'd be something that would be pretty easy to pipe into an experience, presumably.
I think so. I think that one in particular would lend itself to that.
And it sounds like it's a very useful one as a single measure. I mean, obviously there's no single measure that ever captures all of the nuance, but we're not in a world where we have infinite amount of information. So
we were talking before about this sort of mind-body connection, and one of the areas that I've been focusing on is this sort of what's called peripheral nervous system expression. You have the brain, and then it has these neurological connections throughout the body to all these different sensory systems and expression systems, and you can think of the peripheral nervous system as a kind of gift, really. Like, I mean, for many reasons, but in terms of like trying to develop like this relationship to like AR environments or VR environments, in a way it's sort of a kind of deciphering of the human body and that's or deciphering of phenomena that's happening with people or the way that people are, that is perhaps maybe a little bit even harder to get to by looking at the EEG, because the EEG is kind of a complicated measure, and if we could put like probes inside the brain, like look at different spots of it, we maybe would be able to do I think considerably better, but we're like for non-invasive work, we're kind of constrained to the outside,
right.
And it's a little bit of like a Faraday cage, and so it's because it's bathed in blood, and so when you look at it, it's hard to know like how to localize a signal and where it's from, and certain things can look like other things, and it's a kind of jumble of data.
People's brains are different as well, I would imagine.
Yeah, there's all kinds of things.
All sorts of sources of error for that one.
It's super interesting to look at, I think, but there's a lot that peripheral nervous system expression can give you that's very direct about the way someone might be feeling in terms of like their representation of whatever affect, and so it's a kind of they're sort of like apples that can be plucked from the tree, in terms of learning about people.
That is great news for everybody who wants to play with this stuff, because there's tons of hardware that's available. There's a signal that isn't super complex, so you can associate it to how you want that interaction to show up in the experience pretty simply. So that's all very happy news.
I've seen some really awesome VR demos that incorporate physiology.
Yeah, tell me about your favorite ones.
One of them was made by a fellow, Chris, I believe, and I forget the fellow he was working with, but they were two people at the conscious hacking mansion that I stayed at for a bit, and they were working on a VR representation, which was a kind of field, and like a meadow, and they had the ability to measure respiration, and then when they did that, you could simulate the respiratory pattern into the entire field that you saw, and so as people would breathe out, you would see these ripples go out into the meadow, and then the ripples would come back into your body, and it was just a super visceral representation of like the breath, and then one's impact on the breath and the environment, and I just thought that one was really quite beautiful, and I think it's similar to what there was a fellow that gave maybe remind me his name, on Deep.
Yeah, Owen Harris of Deep.
Yes, Owen, exactly, right. He had a very similar kind of, and I love that project too.
Yeah. I have interviewed him and Nikki because I love their work so much, and I'll put links to their stuff as well. Awesome. So just to sort of wrap up, is there something that you suspect is true but you can't prove it yet? Favorite insights brewing on the back burners?
Suspect is true about what?
About anything.
Oh, that I suspect people are kind of connected to each other in ways that really probably are difficult to imagine.
I think that's very true. I think we are synchronizing with the people around us in ways that we aren't really consciously aware of. Like if you are at a concert and the singer is doing a very good job, they are actually synchronizing some of the brainwaves in an interesting way, and you wouldn't necessarily be aware of that. Mm-hmm. Your heart rate is different because you're at that concert.
Yeah.
If we could surface that information, like, wouldn't it be fascinating if you had a whole group of people that were wearing a heart rate monitor to see if there's some resonances of heart rate in there?
When we started this conversation, I mentioned that I was an artist also, and one of the projects I've just finished is called Biometric Campfire, and it's a kind of like campfire chairs, and each one is outfitted with, they're sensitive to human physiology, and when you sit in the chair, it measures your heartbeat, and then you feel your heart actually in the back, in your back. And so it kind of amplifies your heart and then presents it, and then also transmits it to the chair next to you.
Oh, that's
and then
amazing.
so and there's 6 chairs, and so they all feel their own, and then they transmit it to the chair next to them. So it's a kind of linked physiological, kind of like supraorganism, sort of, connected by this like relationship of the heart. And then there's a kind of deconstructed, like a postmodern fire in the center, which is just made out of electricity and light. And
that's amazing.
And so when the heartbeats synchronize, then the fire gets bigger and brighter, and when they desynchronize, it dies. But it's kind of an exploration of this exact topic, like how to kind of just explore that idea of like you know, when do we sort of line up, and when do we don't, and what does that mean, or what does that feel like? It's not making any claims about anything.
No, not at all. It's surfacing data that's otherwise not visible.
Exactly, right, yeah.
So what does it feel like? You've presumably done this a few times with different folks.
Well, it's really new. I've said it a few times with people, and it's odd. It's an odd experience. Some people find it very strange, and other ones just become quite enamored with it. It's, you know, and I think also some people are very it becomes intuitively obvious what's happening, and then other people just it has to be kind of explained to them.
Right.
And it's just maybe a little unfamiliar.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's drifting around right now. It's a project and it's dropped in some different kind of gallery environments and
love it
and things, but it's just kind of starting to percolate. So I don't know. I can't report a lot back on it right now.
All right. Well, I'll be very curious. I hope I get a chance to try it out.
Great. Yeah.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you, Crystal.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Everything's okay. I'm just trying to act my age. Everything's okay.